Hello, my name's Patricio Duran. This is my video submission for my Pick a Presidency research project with the American Presidency class at ASU. Of course, you already know that since you're watching this. But anyways, so to jump right into it, since we're short on time, I chose President John F. Kennedy for my research project, and we'll get right into it. So his path to the White House. He was originally from Massachusetts, and during his presidential election, his opponent was then the Vice President Richard Nixon, who he defeated by an 84 electoral vote margin, which was 303 electoral votes for Kennedy and 219 for the Vice President Richard Nixon. And of course, following that, he served from 1961 until his assassination in November of 1963, where then he was then followed by his then VP, Lyndon B. Johnson. Um, so yeah, given of course he was obviously very competitive during the primaries, given he later won the presidential election. Um, some of the key opposition he felt during the primaries was one his Catholic faith. I'd say that was the primary, and then the secondary probably his young age, his relatively young age. Usually, you'll see presidents elected at around the age from 50 to 60, um, where President Kennedy at the time was only 43 years old. So it's kind of amazing. Um, but anyways, and that conversely, Richard Nixon at the time wasn't that much older either. I think he was only 46 or 47. Um, so, but obviously he didn't win that race. But yeah, so the swing states during that presidential election included really Hawaii, Illinois, Missouri, California, and New Mexico. And how those states compare today is they're really all kind of shifted more left, whereas Missouri, except for Missouri, who has shifted right. So really very different. Especially if you go back and you look at our course materials, and you can kind of see that trend as far as how they've over time have leaned one direction uh, versus the other. But anyway, so we'll talk now about his domestic policy, some of the successes and unsuccesses with those during his term. So we'll start with a successful one. I found interesting research regarding the Area Redevelopment Act of 1961, which he pushed through and stated himself in 61 that had great bipartisan support, um, which was interesting. And so the intent of the Area Redevelopment Act of 1961 was really to just target high unemployment communities, kind of strength, which broadly aligns with some of their campaign promises as far as economic growth and increasing the American living standard, um, which was again was kind of yeah, it was a promise, and was stated by the Democratic Party in 1960. You'll see that in the references I provided with the submission. But anyways, yeah, and I think he was able to kind of consolidate that bipartisan support because it was kind of sold on the ideas of not federal spending. Well, it was on the ideas of kind of like loans and grants, but not federal spending, as well as kind of garnering local participation, as well as creating jobs and not federal assistance. Um, so I think that was a good sell for that, and probably which is why the reason he kind of was able to push it through. Conversely, when it's unsuccessful kind of policies or domestic policies that President Kennedy tried to push that failed was his federal aid to education. It seemed like there was one of the key issues really regarding this legislation was that the separation between church and state, where there was a lot of concern about kind of giving federal aid to religious education systems, which is kind of what ended up, you know, not allowing him to push it through. But that being said, uh, Lyndon B. Johnson, after Kennedy, was able to kind of achieve a lot of those goals that along those lines that President Kennedy was trying to accomplish. Um, so lastly, I'll talk about the foreign policy as well as I'll conclude with the midterms. For the foreign policy aspect, I think one of the big foreign policy crises that President Kennedy met during his term was the Cuban Missile Crisis, um, which lasted around, I think it's 13 days, about 2 weeks, in October of 1962, mid-October, like 1962 to, well, mid to late October 1962. Wow, oh my God. Anyways, so with that crisis, basically what it entailed was that we had national intelligence kind of identify that the Soviet Union, the USSR, was emplacing nuclear missiles on Cuba, which was, of course, Cuba was with Fidel Castro. That was kind of a national security concern with us, given how close they were to, the United States, or how close they are to the United States. But anyways, obviously this was a concern considering, nuclear missiles being able to range the United States. But anyways, so with that, obviously, so how President Kennedy kind of met that crisis is that he he established a naval quarantine, which was really a blockade. They just used different terms to kind of sell it more diplomatically, so it's not you know it's just an easier sell when you're saying kind of like these words that are not essentially, I don't know what to say, militarily kind of related or easy to pass. Anyways, um, yeah, so he set up a naval quarantine, which is just a blockade, and in order to mitigate the Soviet Union continuing to push, um, you know, this nuclear arms as well as support and all the aid in order to, kind of the proliferation of nukes there at Cuba to avoid it. Um, while doing that, he was, of course, using strong diplomatic affairs with the USSR, and kind of, obviously considering other military aspects as well, as far as, I know there are, military advisors with the administration that was kind of advising all kinds of things, whereas that was, taking military action, more firm military action against Cuba and whatnot. But that never all came to fruition, even though it kind of became very high stakes at certain points, according to my research. But President Kennedy was able to mitigate it all with, again, the diplomatic foreign affairs, eventually getting the USSR to the Soviet Union to back off, essentially, with that idea of giving nuclear um, arms or emplacing nuclear arms for Cuba to utilize in some conflict with us, some conflict. But anyway, so with that, President Kennedy, based off my research, accrued kind of like very strong support from the public, according to polling that I had found. That's also will be in my references that you'll see. And as far as the congressional attitudes, I think that was proven as very supportive as well, considering the strong midterms that followed, that immediately followed that crisis. But I'll get back to that in a second. Um, so I think overall, according to my research, very strong support with how President Kennedy, reacted to that foreign crisis. Um, Another successful foreign policy, well, I guess not a crisis, but a policy that I had found based off my research was really establishing the Peace Corps by executive order in 1961. This was kind of built with the idea of supporting our efforts with the Cold War, kind of helping the underdeveloped or unmodernized nations with volunteer work and winning kind of hearts and minds was one of the premise, or not the premise, but was one of the kind of base ideas for putting that together, which I think long term has shown to be very successful, considering by the end of the 20th century they had sent over like 170,000 American volunteers to over 135 nations, according to the University of Virginia, so UVA. Um, so very successful policy, and it's proven to be, one that's served its purpose long term. But anyway, so we'll go back to. I'll kind of conclude again, like I mentioned, with the midterms. I think especially because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think that being only about a month or so before, immediately following the Cuban Missile Crisis was the midterms, where President Kennedy's political party did extraordinarily well. They and did not at all follow the kind of the laws of the, or the so-called law of the midterm, um, and yeah, they only lost about 4 seats in the House of Representatives and gained about 4 in the Senate, um, which proved, especially if you compare to recently, is excellent. So again, um, I think his reaction and his abilities to handle the again the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that being so fresh in everybody's minds, and then leading right into the midterms, as well as kind of all the other things he accomplished that I had talked to so far in this speech. I think that really kind of paved the way for the midterms, and for how well the Democratic Party was able to do during then. But yeah, that's about everything. All in all, I will say, of course, President John F. Kennedy is very far beyond my time, but I'm very interested in American history, so it was very interesting to kind of look at things more more deliberately, as far as kind of where he succeeded or was unsuccessful during his short term um, of presidency, and it's been very educational for me. So yeah, I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good evening.